What I'm going to talk about today is based on two large-scale projects of collective multi-sited ethnography that I co-directed in 2013 and 2015, in which networks of researchers coming from different disciplines studied what happens on and around the 9th of May, which is Victory Day in the Soviet tradition, around Soviet war memorials. Victory Day is by far the largest military commemorative holiday in the world today in terms of the numbers of people that celebrate it, but also the breadth of the geography in which it's celebrated. And this map gives you a rough idea of the places that we actually did research in the two waves of that project. And the project is documented in these two edited volumes, one of which came out in German and the other in Russian. Unfortunately, there's not very much in English. So I'm interested today in one specific, one particular aspect that kept striking me when I was engaged in this ethnographic work. So the standard situation at Victory Day celebrations is that there's a large array of emotions that's being displayed, which ranges from sadness to joy to pride to nostalgia, etc., etc. And I won't go into the kind of historical context and the details, but what's interesting to me is that very often we find that in situations where commemorative conflict might be expected on that date, actually no such conflict occurs. So emotional expressions coexist, and so do symbols of attachments that often are seen as opposed to each other. So for example, what I'm showing you here is a photo I took in Madrid at a Victory Day celebration in May 2019 with lots of people from various post-Soviet contexts. And what's interesting about this picture is that there's a large variety and a sort of complex arrangement of symbols that you might see as being completely opposed to each other and kind of connoting different kinds of emotions associated with this day. So for example, you have people with Ukrainian flags, which is really interesting because this is in the middle of a military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where celebrations of Victory Day have become kind of vehicles of geopolitical conflict that are seen by all the sides involved as sort of continuation of the Second World War. But even so, you find people with Ukrainian flags here, you find people with Russian flags, you find people wearing these orange and black St. George's ribbons, which are commemorative symbols that were initially introduced in Russia and have now become associated with kind of support of Russian foreign policy, even though technically they're commemorative symbols linked to the Second World War. You see a replica of the flag that was hoisted in May 1945 on the Reichstag building in Berlin by Red Army soldiers, etc., etc. So you see a wide array of symbols that in kind of discursive debates linked to this date are usually seen as being completely opposed to each other. So you have these kinds of things, and at the same time, you do have situations where conflict does occur and where it's seen as very strong. And it's usually seen as arising from perceptions of insufficiently profound or authentic attachment to the place where the commemoration takes place. So, for example, people twerking in front of monuments, in this particular case in a town in Russia, and they actually were imprisoned for a brief period of time in response to this. Or in extreme cases, people using eternal flames to fry eggs or to urinate or various other things of the sort. So what's interesting is that sometimes you have conflict that might be seen as relatively unexpected. In other situations where you would expect conflict, you don't have any conflict. And this is also something that occurred when I took students, for example, to do fieldwork with me at the Treptower Park Memorial in Berlin, which is the biggest Soviet War Memorial outside of the former Soviet Union, built in 1949. And what happened was that my students, especially students socialized in the West German tradition, so with no previous exposure to the socialist tradition, was scandalized by the presence in that commemorative space of people and symbols that they associated with the radical left or the radical right, and whom they kind of read as denoting straightforward political messages. And they were shocked that no one directly confronted these people. So people exhibiting Stalin portraits or, you know, symbols of right-wing or left-wing parties, etc. So for these students, the whole event was basically contaminated by the presence of these individuals, and they no longer were interested in even kind of studying what was going on. And what I wanted to do in the rest of this presentation is try to look at this through the prism of theories of emotions. And what I found in sort of looking at this in connection with existing theories of emotions is that the dominant theories are somewhat unsatisfying for explaining both the absence and the presence of kind of emotional conflict around commemoration. So many existing theories in the history and sociology of emotions identify basically lists of emotions, and then they postulate that there is a fixed way in which these emotions correlate with each other, either in society as a whole or within certain communities. So let me illustrate this just with two well-known approaches, and I take these from the history of emotions, but I think the same could be said for many kind of current theories in the sociology of emotions. So if we look at the well-known concept of an emotional regime as coined by William Reddy, he defines this as the, and this is my emphasis, the set of normative emotions and the official rituals, practices, and motives that express and inculcate them. So the basic idea here is that in any given society, at any given point in time, there is basically one configuration of emotions that is prevalent among the elites. And then maybe there are spaces that serve as refuges from these configurations where other kinds of emotions are possible. And then he illustrates that with examples from the French Revolution. And then at some point, these kind of emotional configurations in the refuges might, through kind of an emotional revolution, become newly dominant. But what basically he postulates is that within any given context, there will be one relatively rigid way in which emotions correlate with each other. If we take the concept of emotional communities as explored by Barbara Rosenwein in her work on early medieval history, she defines this as social groups whose members adhere to the same valuations of emotions and their expression. So once again, instead of a single dominant regime, here there are different communities that can coexist at the same time, but that will define and value emotions differently. But still within the same community, basically there will be one fixed configuration. And both of these models and many others like them are essentially two-dimensional in that they posit that only one emotional configuration is available at any given point in time and space, even though Rosenwein, for example, acknowledges that individuals can move between emotional communities. So what I want to try and do is suggest a more dynamic model that accounts for actors' capacity to experience and express emotions differently in different social settings. And this builds on a first sketch that I kind of tried out in my book on protest in Russia, and I want to try and develop this a little bit. So my approach is based on the sociology of regimes of engagement developed by the French sociologist Laurent Thévenot and multiple collaborators. And I do want to stress here, because many of you, especially those who don't read French, will know his earlier collaborative work with Luc Boltanski on justification, which last year was translated into Portuguese and came out in Brazil. But what I want to stress is that my approach draws not so much on justification, but on Thévenot's later work on regimes of engagement. So what are regimes of engagement? What's important to understand here is that they are not discursive constructs, but they are pragmatic modes of acting in ways that are appropriate to a situation that we encounter as agents. And they enable us to calibrate our actions by assessing the cues provided by our surroundings according to one of several possible conventional formats. And each such regime is a different way of practically evaluating the situation, of formatting the relevant information, and of deploying capacities. And then these regimes give rise to grammars of commonality and difference, or political grammars, which are basically specific ways of differing from each other. So in any given situation, there are potentially infinite ways in which we can define and arrange the differences between the actors present at that situation, but we are socialized into acting within a bounded number of regimes of engagement, which give rise to a limited number of ways in which we can conceive of commonality and difference between different actors. And I know this is very compressed due to the limited time. But what's important here is that 4 regimes have been identified so far through basically decades of comparative cross-cultural empirical research. And they are the regime of planned action, in which basically we project ourselves into the future and we act in terms of plans, tactics, strategies, agendas, and we conceive of ourselves as autonomous individuals who basically choose from sort of a menu of options of possible ways of acting. There is the regime of justification, in which we draw on certain societal conventions about how our actions in that situation can benefit the common good, and how therefore we can respond to potential critique by justifying our actions and kind of referring to these orders of worth. The regime of familiarity, which is based on a kind of pre-reflexive ease in the situation, a familiarity with the things that we encounter in the situation, where we are not really required to engage in any sort of justification or in planning ahead and in planning our action. We are just, at ease. And the regime of exploration, where on the contrary, we treat the situation as something that's completely novel, that is a source of excitement, and in which we are constantly faced with changes and with the new that we have to explore. And then the grammars of commonality and difference that arise from these regimes, they are not just kind of mechanical extensions to the collective level, but they need to provide a specific way of differing, of conceiving of difference between different agents. They need to provide a mode of communication, of making things common and bridging differences. They require intermediary objects, and they need to provide a way of articulating differences and potentially arranging them hierarchically. And I know this is cryptic, but if you have specific questions about any of the regimes or grammars, I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A. What's important here, and basically this is the same thing arranged in the form of a table, and I won't go into the details, but basically what's important here is that there is an assumed background engagement in every situation in which we encounter each other, and there's a corresponding grammar of commonality and difference. And what I want to do, and what I've been trying to do in my kind of theoretical work on the emotions, is supplement this very kind of fleshed out theoretical approach with emotional regimes that correspond to each of these regimes and each of these grammars. So what I want to suggest is that there is an emotional regime that corresponds to the grammar of orders of worth, which builds on justification, where our emotions are related to the order of worth that we see as applying to this situation. So, for example, we can experience righteous indignation, we can experience moral satisfaction because we think that kind of the right kinds of norms and values that are appropriate to the situation are met or are not met. Then we have an emotional regime that corresponds to the regime of individual plan and the corresponding grammar of individual interest, where we express our emotions in a conventional format. And this will be familiar to all of you, not least from our activities in social networks, because social networks, of course, are a wonderful example of a platform that kind of provides us with a fixed menu of emotional options and forces us to format our own attachments, our own concerns along a kind of a given discrete spectrum of existing emotional expressions. And if we manage to do so, then our emotions become recognizable to the others. But if not, then there is a problem of emotional communication. Then in the regime of familiarity and the resulting grammar of what Tivno calls commonplaces, what becomes important is the depth of authenticity or of empathy that is on display regardless of the sort of justificatory content of the emotions. And in the grammar of improvisation or exploration, what is important is the excitement about the novelty of the situation. And I would suggest that in addition to these emotional, so what's important to stress here is that none of this says anything about the content of any individual emotion. What this does essentially is propose a way in which in any given situation, the emotions can be arranged and articulated with each other, not just in the form of a list, so anger here, fear there, but in ways in which kind of emotions are formatted for difference and commonality. And I would further suggest that each emotional regime comes with a certain idea or a certain experience of emotional deviance or bad affect. So this basically answers the question, what kind of emotion is considered deviant in each of these regimes? And I would say that in the regime of orders, in the grammar of orders of worth, if your emotions are too personal and you do not manage effectively to relate them to an existing order of worth, that is considered emotionally deviant. In the regime of individual interests, if you exhibit a codependence or a lack of emotional autonomy, so for example, your emotions are seen as not really deriving from your own individuality, but from other factors, that is seen as deviant. Or failure to engage in self-care and in attention to your own emotions is also seen as a bad kind of affect, once again, regardless of what the content of the emotion is. In the grammar of commonplaces, the problem would be inauthentic emotions. So if you don't effectively express your emotions in ways that display the depth of your attachment to a particular commonplace, that becomes a problem. And in the grammar of improvisation or creative expression, the problem is if you're indifferent or you exhibit a lack of emotional openness, you're not sufficiently excited, right? And then studying particular emotional configurations and particular social settings, we can also observe kind of composite emotional regimes that draw on elements of these different sort of ideal types. And examples that I would propose of such composite emotional regimes would be if we combine, for example, the regime of individual interest with the regime of exploration, we get something that might be a liberal emotional regime or a regime of emotional capitalism that we're familiar with from some of the literature in the sociology of emotions. So, how are you feeling? Are you excited? Typical questions that we encounter in sort of emotional capitalist settings, where the expectation is that emotions must be expressed individually. There cannot possibly be such a thing as a collective emotion. And there is an excitement that points towards a planned action, even though the result as yet is unknown, because we have to kind of experience the different possible outcomes of the situation that needs to be explored. And this favors, of course, future-oriented emotions such as hope. Then if we combine the regime of individual interest with personal affinities and familiarity, we get the modern therapeutic regime that Eva Luz has elegantly described. If we combine personal affinities and familiarity with orders of worth, then we get something like an emotional regime of a defense of a shared life world. So if we feel that our emotional life worlds with our kind of habitual emotions are being threatened, then we can combine that with a form of justification that refers to existing orders of worth, and we get this kind of composite emotional regime. And if we combine the orders of worth with exploration, maybe we get something like the kind of collective effervescence that we often encounter in protest and social movement settings. So I'm finishing and getting back to my own empirical example and the question that I started with: how can we kind of conceive of both the presence and the lack of emotional context in these kinds of these kinds of commemorative settings? And I would suggest that what happens here very often is that we encounter a clash between an emotional regime that is based on a grammar of orders of worth, where the expectation is that every commemorative symbol and every commemorative action basically is expressive of a certain norm or a certain, political ideology that refers, for example, to a construction of community, where, displaying a portrait of Stalin refers to Stalin as the leader of a particular kind of regime, etc. And on the other hand, a regime that is based on commonplaces, where what matters really is simply the depth of your attachment to what is being commemorated, and the political articulations of that attachment don't really matter. This is something that I've observed again and again over the years, doing my field work and my ethnography on these commemorative settings, where people who you would never be able to put together in a room for a political debate, because they come from completely different political backgrounds, and they come with symbols that in a kind of debate or voting setting would be seen as completely opposed to each other, can coexist very, very peacefully, and in fact even form at least situational emotional bonds across political divides, because they can communicate to each other and convince each other that they all have very strong and authentic emotional bonds to, for example, the victory of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, the monuments erected to commemorate that victory, etc. And I think that by articulating and kind of bringing out these different emotional regimes that are involved in these commemorative settings, we can maybe contribute to more mutual understanding and maybe a richer dialogue across these emotional divides. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this theory-laden presentation. I see that Dennis already raised her hand, so I let her go first. Dennis?
Sorry, I just forgot to lower my hand.
Oh, you did it. Okay. Okay. Anybody else? I will take a couple of questions right now.
I can ask a question if you want. It was really dense presentation, but I was wondering about your last words on the protest settings. And do you think you can explain this kind of togetherness that is not possible in other contexts, but that become possible by emotional bonds in social protest? Can you explain it by the ritualization of the commemorations, or by the co-presence of alterity in a ritualized way, when there is no discursive communication, but only some ritualized gatherings? Do you think that it could be useful, however, to think in these anthropological terms? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think there's a really interesting contrast here between protest settings and commemorative settings, and I've worked on both of them. And in my protest book, I tried to apply the sociology of regimes of engagement to the study of protest. And what I noticed doing fieldwork in protest settings is that there is always a wide variety of regimes of engagement at play. And for example, a lot of people, go to protest events not because they have a fixed set of ideas that they want to protest in favor of, but because they're explorers, right? And because, especially in authoritarian settings, protest events are among the few settings in which they can actually explore the diversity of sort of political positions and emotional configurations in their society. And then the emotional regimes that come with that also exhibit a lot of diversity. So, I have a section in that book about how in the Russian context that I studied, there was a strong kind of individualistic emotional regime that was being offered by oppositional activists, who basically suggested that people should come with their own emotions, but not talk at all about where these emotions come from or the kinds of communities that they're anchored in. And that tended to alienate a lot of people who thought that they would come there as representatives of a certain emotional community that wanted a kind of an echo for their own emotional concerns. And that contributed to the demise of that particular protest movement. And so what I think is is an important difference between typical commemorative settings and typical protest settings is that, as you said, the ritualization tends to be much stronger in commemoration, even though we also encounter it in protest. And this kind of ritualization tends to be more hospitable to a sort of a grammar of commonplaces, where the idea is that people engage in a sort of emotional resonance based on the tacit understanding that they all have a strong bond with the thing that's being commemorated, that they don't even need to articulate verbally, right? Even though, you know, the content of the bond might be different, but everybody who kind of congregates in that space on that day kind of assumes that the others are there for a strong emotional reason. Whereas in a protest setting, typically, you know, the kinds of emotional bonds are very different, and they also tend to be very fluid. But there are also interesting kind of intersections between the two that I also try to explore in some of my work. Yeah.
Anybody else? I have a lot to say, but maybe just one little question which picks up on what you just said. Why didn't you stick with the concept of different emotional communities, of which different representatives come? And the interesting thing is that they find a shared common denominator in the idea, as you said, that they have as a strong emotional bond, no matter what kind of bond. But the question is more theoretical. Why didn't you just assume, I mean, Reddy worked with absolutist regimes, so he had this homogenic set of values, but even he had emotional refuge, so it means many different communities. And the same thing with the other historian that you mentioned, Rosenzweig. It implies pluralism.
Yeah, so my problem with the term of community is that it's too static. It's almost as if people were walking around with a label on their forehead saying, I'm a member of emotional community A, B, or C. What is really important to me is that this is not about like specific sets of people that are different from each other, qua members of that set. It's much more situational, because the very same people in a different setting, in a different configuration, or sometimes even like, you know, in the same place, but given some event that occurs there, can switch to a different kind of regime. And what's important to me about the whole architecture of regimes and grammars is that it's much more, it accounts much better for the diversity and the tensions of coordination that we encounter within ourselves as actors with plural attachments, and not just between members of static communities. And that to me is the main difference here.
I really enjoyed your presentation, especially because it offers this flexibility in the analysis of emotions. And I know that you showed also the different dimensions in which different members of a group can have different emotional responses. But I wanted to ask you, how do you include the temporal dimension there? Is it something that affects how people respond to something? It is something that is generational, or it really doesn't matter, that model can be applied without taking that much into consideration the category of time? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I just posted something in the chat, Sandra, if you're interested. I actually wrote a paper on temporality for the Handbook of Memory Activism that's going to come out, I think, next year. So my response would be that different regimes of engagement tend to apply different kinds of temporalities. When you're in the regime of familiarity, you're basically at ease with your surroundings. And the importance is in the kind of here and now of your connection to you know, what surrounds you, but also your connection with the past, which is why this is a particularly important regime for memory studies. Whereas when you're in, for example, a regime of individual interest or of plan, then that implies automatically that you're kind of projecting yourself into the future, right? You're treating your surroundings as something which, in a sense, you have to kind of evaluate in a calculating way, right? How can I mine this for resources? How can I kind of strategize about this? So once again, you know, I wouldn't approach this topic in terms of discrete groups. that have, I mean, I've written also about generations and commemoration, but I think what's really interesting here is that, you know, one and the same person, regardless of what generation they belong to, what kind of, you know, social group they might identify with in different settings, they can have different approaches. And what's important for the temporality is that sometimes unexpected events can occur in a commemorative space that completely change the regime that is at stake. And, you know, in my work, I've observed kind of unexpected commemorative conflicts that flared up all of a sudden, like people coming with like flags of countries that are at war with each other and coexisting very, very peacefully. And then all of a sudden a conflict breaks out because somebody decided to turn this contrast into a matter of explicit political debate, right? So in terms of temporality, I think what's really important is to look at the sort of the fine-grained changes that can occur in the space of an event and see how the temporality is affected by that.
One more thing, Misha, the memorials that you're talking about were there for a long time before anybody started commemorating anything there, right? Isn't that so?
So, I mean, the short answer is often yes. Because ironically, even though, so now we're talking about the monuments outside of the Soviet Union, let's say in East Germany. Ironically, even though they were built as early as the 1940s, during the Cold War, most people from the Soviet Union weren't able to travel there because of the Iron Curtain. So they were mostly used for kind of very highly choreographed official ceremonies where, you know, there was no leeway to just do your own thing. Whereas what happens now is that this kind of totalitarian control is completely gone. And we find these plural commemorative communities that congregate in this space where there is no single agency that would kind of introduce any sort of rules or choreography. And instead they try to sort of reinvent and improvise based on what they remember from, for example, their own childhood in the Soviet Union or from, you know, stuff that that is important to them. And this is really fascinating to observe often.